Hello, it's me, Miss Terrell, and I am here for your second edition installment, rather, of your Period 4 lectures and notes. Today we are looking at Madison's presidency. Jefferson, of course, retires from presidency after a second term. He's kind of had enough. His second term was pretty rough, as we discussed. His party's nomination for president, and Jefferson supported it, was his close friend and also the guy who served as Secretary of State, James Madison. The election of 1808 was fairly interesting. Madison was viewed as a brilliant thinker. He worked with Jefferson developing the Democratic Republican Party. He was, however, viewed typically as a weak public speaker. He was stubborn. He was known for having a wild temperament, and essentially he lacked Jefferson's political skills. So pretty much this was going to be a bumpy ride from the get-go. One of the first major issues that that Madison is going to deal with off the bat is some of the same international issues that Jefferson got fed up dealing with. And that would be commercial warfare. Madison essentially attempted a combination of diplomacy and economic pressures to deal with the Napoleonic Wars. France was going to be like a tiny dog barking at our heels during this whole time. Napoleon, I shouldn't say France, I should say Napoleon was a small barking dog, very annoying. Unlike Jefferson, however, Madison finally consents to take the U.S. to war. Jefferson was dead set against it. Madison kind of succumbs to the pressures of the people around him. Under Madison is passed the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809, in which Americans could now trade with all nations except for Britain and France. Also, we see under Madison Macon's Bill Number 2, which comes out in 1810. Nathaniel Macon, who is a member of Congress, introduces a bill that essentially restores U.S. trade with Britain and France. The bill provides that attends that if either Britain or France formally agree to respect the U.S. neutral rights at sea, the U.S. would prohibit trade with nations that are their foe, essentially. Napoleon, who is a weaselly rascal, hears Congress's action here, and he announces his intention to revoke the decrees that violated U.S. neutral rights. Madison essentially then carries out Macon's Bill Number 2 by embargoing U.S. trade with Britain in 1811. However, it soon becomes obvious that Napoleon has no intentions of fulfilling his promise, and the French continue to seize American ships. And this is where the impressment comes in and pirate type situations, and becomes very taxing on the president as well as the people of America. They're frustrated. Essentially, we see the beginning of the War of 1812. We're going to look at the causes of the war from the U.S. point of view or perspective. The biggest one being the continued violation of U.S. neutral rights at sea, and of course the troubles with the British on the western frontier. Again, with the Louisiana Purchase, we've pushed the boundaries and the borders, but we still have a presence by Britain. Free seas and trade. Okay, so as a trading nation, the United States depends on the free flow of shipping across the Atlantic, right? Britain and France have no interest in respecting the U.S.'s neutrality rights, mostly because they were locked in a struggle with each other. They essentially want the United States to take one side, and it's not going well because the United States doesn't want to do that. Also, you need to think about the U.S. view on France at the time. We applaud their ability to overthrow their monarchy and have their own revolution, the French Revolution. The French also helped us during the Revolution. They really saved our biscuits. Who knows if they had not shown up what the outcome of the war would have been. And the U.S. felt that the British violations to the U.S. neutral rights were worse, and the impressment of U.S. sailors really sent them off. So the French and the United States had more in common in this situation than the British and the U.S. Now, looking more at the British, we have these pressures out on our frontier. Because of Lewis and Clark and their expedition, Louisiana Purchase, and so on and so forth, Americans are now on the western frontier, and they wanted even more land. And they wanted the lands of British Canada as well as Spanish Florida. Obviously, the British and their Indian and Spanish allies were standing in the way, and we're looking to get rid of those issues. The conflict with the American Indians and the Western settler is going on all the time. It's at an all-time high at this point. American settlers are continuing to move west, and as they're slowly moving, and not really moving too slowly, but as they're getting further and further west, they're pushing the native population further and further west as well. And this is when we see Tecumseh, who was a Shawnee warrior, a Native American warrior, also known as the Prophet. And he calls upon all the tribes east of the Mississippi to kind of come together and unite themselves. And he feels like if they do this, they have a better chance surviving and also taking on the American people on the frontier. American settlers naturally just become suspicious of what Tecumseh is doing. And they kind of look to the governor of the Indian Territory, who was a man named General William Harrison. And they go to him and they say, look, we think they're getting ready for war. They're doing some weird stuff over there. We really think that you need to take some action. As a result, we see the devastating Battle of Tippecanoe, which happens in 1811. And this is when Harrison and his men essentially destroy the Shawnee headquarters, and they put an end to Tecumseh's efforts to form what essentially would have been an Indian confederacy. Also out of this time period, we see the development of a group of congressmen essentially known as war hawks. And this is a group of new young Democratic Republicans that come to Congress in 1810. And essentially they're all from the frontier states of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. They have a much different perspective than congressmen who have been sitting from, the original 13 colonies, which are now states, and even a little bit further west of the original 13 colonies. They're known as war hawks for their eagerness, of course, to go to war with Britain. They argued that war with Britain would be the only way to defend American honor, gain the lands that we wanted in Canada, and destroy a Native or American Indian resistance on the frontier. They were anxious to have war. They stood behind war 100%. Essentially, we do see a declaration of war. The British delay a meeting. The British delay meeting U.S. demands over neutral rights, combined with political pressures from the war hawks, finally persuade President Madison to seek a declaration of war against Britain. Neither Congress or the people of essentially were united in support of the war. Of the U.S., that should say. Even with the war resolution, Madison is able to win the election of 1812 for a second term. The people who opposed the War of 1812 called it Mr. Madison's War because essentially they feel like he's the only one that wanted it. The Treaty of Ghent is signed by in 1814. The British are weary of war. Madison recognizes that the Americans would be unable to win a decisive victory, so American peace commissioners travel to Ghent, Belgium, and discuss terms of peace with the British. On Christmas Eve of 1814, an agreement is reached. This halted fighting. It returned all conquered territory to pre-war claims. It recognized the pre-war boundary between Canada and the U.S. However, the treaty said nothing at all about the grievances that led to the war. So nothing about neutrality, issues at sea, property, lands, etc., etc., etc. Also, Britain made no concessions concerning impressment, blockades, or other sea issues. The war pretty much ended in a stalemate with no gain for either side. Kind of a little bit of a waste of time, essentially. Switching gears a little bit, I'll talk a little bit about the Hartford Convention. So before the war ended, the New England states threatened to secede from the Union. They bitterly opposed the War of 1812, as well as the Democratic Republican government that was sitting in Washington. So they get together in Hartford and they hold this convention where they're going to secede from the Union. Looking at the legacy of the war, one, having survived 2 wars with Britain, the U.S. essentially gained respect from other nations at this time. 2, the U.S. accepted Canada as part of the British Empire, and they're no longer going to try to not conquer, but settle lands from there or in their space. 3, the Federalist Party came to an end as a national force and declined, even in its strongest regional area, which was in New England. And number 4, talk of nullification and secession in New England set a precedent of what later would be used by the South when we start to talk about the Civil War. Number 5, abandonment or abandon by the British American Indians were forced to surrender land to white settlement. So the war is over. Britain kind of pulls out of the situation. Britain and the native population had made an alliance. They were working together. Because the British pull out, the American Indians are now forced to surrender their land, and they're getting pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed, marginalized further and further away. The British, number 6, the British naval blockade limiting European goods. U.S. factories are built, and Americans move forward expeditiously towards industrial self-sufficiency. This is really shifting gears from Jefferson's agricultural kind of expectations that he had for the United States. And now we're really going to see a full-on move into industrialization. Number 7, war heroes such as Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison would soon be in the forefront of a new generation of political leaders. We know that Andrew Jackson later becomes the President of the United States. And finally, the feeling of nationalism grows stronger, as did the belief that the future of the U.S. lay west and away from Europe. So it's sort of becoming the American destiny to conquer the rest of the continent in terms of the continental U.S. out from coast to coast, essentially. And that is what we have for today. Our next lecture will look at nationalism and economic developments. So hope you have a great day and take care. See ya.